In this video, we're going to consider plant and animal diseases, what causes them, and how this might impact agricultural production. And it's important to realise that Australia really relies heavily on agricultural exports. It has a unique geographic isolation and therefore disease-free status in lots of its produce because it is an island and it can keep diseases out. So there are risks when it comes to thinking about Australian agriculture, both risks of diseases that already exist here and that might come in. So we need to be really careful to consider both of those risks. Any disease outbreak on a farm, actually there are three things that are important here. There's things to do with the host, that's the thing that gets the disease, the pathogen, the organism that's causing the disease or the entity that's causing the disease, and environmental factors too. And there has to be an interplay between these three for disease to become a real possibility. There are lots of increases in the risk of getting disease. We will have a look at each of those, as well as thinking about problems that will happen not just to the plant or the animal, but also to the farmer and to the nation of Australia that we have to think about when we're considering diseases in the agricultural area. And there are people both locally, nationally and internationally that monitor disease. So when we think about the market for disease in Australia, these are the values. So nearly $10 billion of value in the beef industry of Australia. And that's about half that amount for the wheat exports, primary industry value, both exports and local markets. And then you can see even all the way down here, barley, still looking at $1 billion worth of value. So huge amount of money in the primary industry of agriculture in Australia. So you can see why it's really important that we understand about how to manage disease. So the two different categories of disease we need to consider: diseases that already exist in Australia. These are endemic diseases. These might include things like anthrax and foot rot. These already exist in Australia and have to be managed. And also exotic diseases. These come in from other countries. So this one is bird flu. It's a type of flu called H5N1, and you've got to report that if you suspect it on your farm. Bovine TB, bovine tuberculosis, that's tuberculosis that cows get. Equine influenza, that's what horses get, type of flu. And Newcastle disease is a disease of poultry. So all our chicken farmers need to keep an eye out for that one. And here's the interplay that I was talking about between the pathogen, the host, and the environment. And all three play a part in managing the outbreak of infectious disease. Let's have a look why. So if you have increased mobility of humans, then there's a likelihood, because these diseases are infectious, they might be carried by the human from one farm to another or from one area of Australia to another. Because there are more intensive and industrial style agriculture practices going on, then once one farm gets it, that intensive nature of that farming means many animals will get it. And if the farming is industrial and on a large scale, that might wipe out a huge proportion of that particular crop or livestock. The way that we use land has changed, so it's much more intensively farmed. Climate change is also resulting in some diseases being more prevalent because maybe drought is stressing crops so that they are more susceptible to disease, for example. And we all know about the fact that there is resistance to antibiotics, things like that. Also to pesticides, because we've been using these chemicals quite a lot now. And there have been, we are selecting for variants within our pathogen pests that mean that they can actually get around the toxicity of antimicrobial drugs or pesticides that are being used. Alongside that, our cattle, our sheep, our crops like wheat, they tend to be more monoculture, one type of crop or one variant of cattle, especially with things like artificial insemination. Many cattle are related to each other, so there's a loss of genetic diversity. Within that, if there's a susceptibility to disease, they will all be equally susceptible. This idea of an increase in hobby farmers, if we're not careful and the hobby farmers don't really know what they're doing, they may inadvertently spread diseases. And even if they do know what they're doing, few sheep here, few sheep there that may not have existed before, they might set up a corridor for the transmission of disease that might not have existed before. And we've also got aquaculture to consider. So that's the use of fish farming or prawn farming or oyster farming. That might change the natural populations and increase the spread of disease. So lots of things that can contribute to disease from the host and the environment point of view. Pathogens are also pretty clever. They have many different ways to be transmitted from one place to another. So I've put a few down here: wind, water, vectors, in other words, traveling on insects, for example, or in contaminated soil, on a human, on machinery or tools, or within contaminated plants. So you might bring in a disease in amongst lots of other plants. There are natural openings in plants, the holes where the gases get in and out. Those are easy places for fungi to get inside a leaf. You might get wounds that open up when an insect bites a plant, or it gets hit by hail or wind or rain. And you can imagine that those with climate change are increasing in severity. You've got to be very careful when you're pruning, not to introduce mechanical damage that isn't carefully cleaned. Now, plants will naturally get rid of any diseased parts of them, but when plants are in high density, or even if animals are in high density, the disease is going to pass between them. It can lead to stress if they're highly if there's high density planting or high density living. The soil conditions may not be optimum, the air circulation may not be optimum. All of these things might increase disease transmission. Let's have a look at the effects of these things. So when there is disease in agricultural production, there are three big things that we need to consider. The biological effects actually on the individual diseased animal or plant, the social and economic factors that affect the farmer, and the social and economic factors that affect the Australian economy. So the actual thing that gets diseased, so the individual plant or animal that gets diseased, all sorts of things can happen. You can end up with rotten produce, the thing could die. Anthrax actually kills cattle and sheep. You could get low growth rate in the young because if they're harbouring parasitic worms, it can take them a lot longer to grow. They may become infertile, lose their appetite, and the product may be no one wants to eat it. Who wants to eat beef that's got warts on it or blemishes on produce? So that would reduce the sellability. Now the farmer itself, they don't get as much money. There's been reduced yield. So they've lost income. There can be financial hardships. There can be stress for the family and for their community. There can be the outcomings of stress like depression, etc. But also the Australian economy will suffer as well. So Australia is known for being disease-free. If it is no longer disease-free, then you're going to lose a lot of trading opportunities within the country and internationally, and you could pass on the disease to humans. There's a disease called Q fever, which can be transmitted from animals to people. So that could also impact the Australian economy if goods or people get quarantined. So let's have a look at a few examples of diseases that you can get in plants that are agricultural. So there's citrus leaf miner here at the top that affects like lemon trees, orange trees. bacterial canker in tomatoes. You've got galls and lumps on roots of things that are growing. It reduces the yield completely. We've got tobacco mosaic virus. That also affects, so that's tomato mosaic virus. There's a tobacco mosaic virus as well. You can get Panama disease, which is a fungus in bananas. It's incredibly difficult to get rid of. And dieback is another fungus that can affect hardwood trees like jarrah, so for the building industry. You've got wasps that will affect and cause growths on plants, and potato blight, and there's blister disease on some large plants down the bottom, courgettes. Lots of bacterial diseases, viral diseases, fungal diseases, etc. for animals here. So all sorts of things caused here, from mastitis and foot rot and TB through rabies, swine flu, lumpy jaw in cattle. That sounds exciting. Really don't want scrapie in sheep, for example, or liver flukes and roundworms or fly strike, which are big parasitic diseases. So lots of different examples, and you just need to remember one or two of those. So the kind of people who manage and coordinate animal diseases, you've got all the state authorities who set up zones like fruit fly free zones or do not transport things beyond this area. But there's also world organizations for animal health that look at epidemics, as well as looking at zoonoses, which is the transmission of diseases from animals to humans.